In the United States, certainly, people feel a great deal of anxiety, in part because there's been a stagnation in the United States, in part because the very thing that you're describing, that is to say, the huge growth in the economies of Asian countries, is seen as a deep and existential threat to the power of our country. And in many ways, you are warning in books like Has China Won and Has the West Lost It? You are warning Americans that this fear that has sort of consumed the country and is definitely present in the second Trump administration is very dangerous and a misunderstanding. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think it's very important to emphasize that economics is never a zero-sum game. It is not a case that, that if I become rich, you necessarily have to become poor. You can have positive sum games. But clearly, that it is still nonetheless a fact that the incomes of the bottom 50% in America's population have been stagnating for several decades. And the question is why? Now, of course, the most popular explanation is that China sucked away the jobs of middle class Americans. But that's not true. Actually, what has happened is that the problem is an internal one, that the United States has functionally become a plutocracy. And I'm not the one who used the word plutocracy. The late Paul Volcker, the former head of the Fed, described the United States as a plutocracy. The Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz described the U.S. as a plutocracy. The Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator of Financial Times, describes the United States as a plutocracy. And essentially, what's happened is that the political system has been hijacked by the very rich. And therefore, as I document in my book, Has China Won? When public policy decisions are made by the United States Congress, instead of trying to help take care of the bottom 50%, the United States Congress, in one way or another, inevitably makes decisions that benefit the top 2%, 5%, 10%, and abandons the bottom 50%. And that's the structural problem. And so it is not China that is stealing away jobs from the United States, it's the United States' inability to deal with its own structural problems within its own society.
Now, you've argued there that U.S. policy is in some ways driven by a a rational effort by those at the top to preserve wealth and power within the internal class system of the United States. But one of the things that also comes across in Has China Won is your belief that much U.S. policy towards China is just driven by emotion and prejudice rather than any real rationality at all. You say that in electing Donald Trump, the rest of the world was shocked that America had elected a president who could not pass an economics 101 undergraduate class. You also talk about the history of yellow peril rhetoric. So here you're talking about things that aren't even really the pursuit of self-interest by American elites, because they're not even based on strategic thinking.
Yes, I think the American elites have a lot to be held accountable for because they have failed their own populations. They haven't been able to create a social and political system that distributes the public goods to their own population and improve the lifestyles and lives of their own populations. But that's a failure of American elites. And that's why, and precisely because the masses, the 50% at the bottom, have not seen any improvement in their living standards, they have become a very angry population, and they wanted to vote for somebody who would give Washington, D.C. a big kick in the butt. And there's no question that Donald Trump is clearly giving Washington, D.C. a big kick in the butt and saying, you guys have not taken care of the people of the United States. Now, of course, unfortunately, his belief that there's only one solution to all these problems, to increase tariffs on every country in the world, I fear is not the answer. And economics 101 will tell you that when you impose tariffs, the cost of the tariffs will not be paid by the exporting country, will be paid by the consumer. And so American consumers are going to find in these coming months that life is going to be very difficult for them as a result of these tariffs. Of course, assuming that the suspension is removed. Of course, if they remain in place, then the tariffs won't do as much damage.
You pointed out that global economics is not a zero-sum game, and another theme that comes across in your writing is that essentially, if we are going to have a prosperous, a peaceful 21st century that deals with the major crises that we face, such as climate change, we are going to have a world that cooperates, a world of mutual respect, and a world where we are sort of capable of, where countries are capable of understanding one another. And in the rhetoric that you hear in the United States about, I mean, Donald Trump openly says China is our enemy. That's his quote. The rest of the world is ripping us off. It is really quite the opposite of the story that you're telling. I mean, you tell a story of us as all inhabiting one planet and a need to sort of work things out. In the United States, the Trumpian narrative is we inhabit a world of enemies. Those enemies need to be tamed or destroyed. We need to build up our ability to crush them militarily if necessary. So it would seem that much of the story told in the United States is really going in the opposite direction of the one that you feel generates the understanding necessary to live well in the 21st century.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. But I can fully understand why Donald Trump wants to try and improve the livelihoods of the bottom 50% of Americans. I think that's a noble goal that he has. I can understand why he wants to make American industries more competitive and reindustrialize America. That's also an understandable goal. But I think he will find that the best way to achieve those goals is actually to work with the rest of the world. And one thing I've learned after studying geopolitics for 55 years is that you got to be cold and calculating if you're going to succeed in geopolitics. And if you're emotional, then you're at a major disadvantage. So, for example, how did China become so wealthy so quickly? What they did was that it worked closely with the United States, even though technically, even during parts of the Cold War, the US was an adversary. China worked with the United States to grow its economy. And I think that's one thing that is taboo in the United States, that actually the best way for United States to regenerate its economic growth and to make it grow faster is not to try and bring down China, but to work with China. Just as at the time when you were worried about Japanese cars taking over United States, what do? You have voluntary export restraints. You encourage the Japanese to set up factories, Toyota factories, Nissan factories, Honda factories in the United States. The same thing can be done with China. It can only be done if you are rational and calculating in your moves and not emotional and say, oh no, we can never work with China. Why can't you work with China? If working with China is going to bring benefits to the American people, why not work with them? Because at the end of the day, it's very clear that all efforts to stop the rise of China by the United States are going to fail. And you cannot stop a 4,000-year-old civilization that has its own civilizational cycles. And as it is rising, just by depriving them of this technology or that technology is not going to stop the rise of China.
And you point out that for most of human history, the Chinese and Indian economies were among the largest in the world. They have the largest global population. And so to try and reverse the trend towards a more equal balance of power in the world, you argue is futile.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fact that everyone should know. That from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world have always been those of China and India. And it's only in the last 200 years that Europe has taken off and North America has taken off. And the last 200 years of Western domination of world history have been a major historical aberration. And all aberrations come to a natural end, so it's perfectly natural to see the return of China and India. But what's important to emphasize is that the reason why China and India are coming back is that they are studying, absorbing, and implementing Western pillars of wisdom, and that's why they're succeeding. And paradoxically, at a time when, for example, China, a communist party-run country, is discovering the virtue of free trade agreements, and free trade agreements have enabled China to become one of the fastest growing economies in the world, the United States is walking away from free trade agreements. But this is where economics 101 theory is right. The United States should be signing more free trade agreements and not walking away from them.
For more current affairs interviews and to get access to full-length interviews before anyone else, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/currentaffairs today.